We're beginning part 1, 1941. Surprise, Kill, Vanish. The secret history of CIA paramilitary armies, operators, and assassins. By the legendary Annie Jacobson. Chapter 1. An office for ungentlemanly warfare. It was the first Sunday in December 1941, and the boys selling popcorn behind the concession stand at the Strand Theater in Bastrop, Texas, had just turned 12. His name was William Dawson Waugh, but everyone called him Billy. Shortly after 2 p.m., Sheriff Edward Cartwright walked into the theater with a terrible look on his face. He told Billy Waugh to run upstairs, have the projectionists shut off the film, and turn on the lights. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, Waugh did as instructed. From high above in the projectionist's booth, he watched as the room full of moviegoers squinted and complained about the movie being interrupted. Then Sheriff Cartwright walked onto the stage and everyone fell silent. "Listen up," the sheriff said. "The Japanese just attacked Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was destroyed and thousands of Americans were dead." What would happen next was anyone's guess, the sheriff said. But it would be foolhardily to rule out the possibility of another attack. Sheriff Cartwright told everyone to go home and cover their windows with blackout material. Listen to the radio and stay informed. Oh. Billy Waugh stayed behind, watching the moviegoers file out. After he finished cleaning up, he went home to the house where he lived with his mother, Lillian, a part-time school teacher, and his older sister, Nancy. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan. 3 days after that, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. And Congress then declared war on Germany and Italy. With America at war around the world, Billy Waugh made a vow to himself: one day I'll go to war. The day Pearl Harbor was bombed and a surprise attack remained imprinted in his mind. By that time, 1941, Billy Waugh knew more about war than most 12-year-old boys. He'd been absorbing information from the newsreels that played before Strand Theater films. Hitler's campaign, Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War astounded him. The idea of total war, of all-out victory at any human cost, was mind-boggling and frightening. It's not right that matters, but victory. Hitler told his generals, act brutally, be harsh and remorseless. The success of the best is by means of force. Of all tactics and techniques being used by the Nazis in the invasion of Western Europe, it was the boldness of the paratrooper unit, Fallschirmjäger, that left Billy Waugh thunderstruck. Newsreel films showed Nazi commandos leaping out of airplanes and parachuting into war theater to launch deadly surprise attacks. Then there was the paraglider attack at the Belgian fortress Eben Emil, once considered the most impenetrable fortresses in the world. 78 Nazi paratroopers, piloting gliders, and armed with flamethrowers, landed on the rooftops of the fortress and overlooked 650 Belgian defenders. a victory from which the Belgian army never recovered. 1 month after the Nazi captured Eben Amil, the U.S. Army created its own paratrooper division in Fort Benning, Georgia, the first in American history. Every spare moment Billy Waugh had, in between school and the 3 part-time jobs he worked as a paper boy, stock boy, and popcorn popper, he gathered information about these paratroopers. The most important items for a successful parachute jump, he learned, were the boots. They were tall, no mid-shin, with rawhide laces and stitching across the toe. Billy Waugh became focused on owning a pair of his own. His alcoholic father had died of cirrhosis of the liver when Billy was 10. The money he earned from his after-school jobs went to his mother to help pay for the family's living expenses. Now, with a clear goal in mind, he began skimming nickels and dimes off his earnings. When he finally saved up $7, he hitchhiked 30 miles to Austin and bought himself a pair of paratrooper shoes. Elated, he felt a step closer to one day becoming a U.S. paratrooper. The world was all right. Across the Atlantic, war raged in Europe. It was May 27th, 1942, and in the Czech town of Holešovice, the Nazi general riding in an armor-plated Mercedes-Benz had been targeted for assassination. SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich was a Janus-like creature. Demon. Blonde, blue-eyed, and beautiful, his skin smooth and pale like of a porcelain doll. But he was also a monster, cruel and sadistic beyond measure. His own boss, Adolf Hitler, described Heydrich as a man with an iron heart. A secret unit inside British intelligence sought to kill him. The assassination plot was called Operation Anthropoid. Concealed on a hillside not far from where Heydrich was driving his Mercedes, 2 British-trained assassins lay in wait. Jans Kubris and Joseph Gabkik, both Czech nationals in their mid-20s, were members of a classified British commando unit that existed inside the British Secret Intelligence Services, Section 6, MI6. Only elite few were aware of these commando units were part of an underground paramilitary army working under the bland-sounding covert name Special Operations Executive. Kubris and Gabkik had been assigned to SOE's division, Special Operations E. SOE, what was SOE? I don't know, refer back to the book. SOE's Division for Destruction. And their work was based on unconventional warfare tactics, also called guerrilla warfare. Let's find where SOE was. I know I read this earlier. Can I find it quickly enough or not this being unbearable? Maybe Special Operations Executive. Gotta keep this page handy. Uh-oh. Lost the page. Special Operations Division D for Destruction. and their work was based on unconventional warfare tactics, also called guerrilla warfare. See, that made a lot more sense, didn't it? The existence of the Special Operations... man, my memory is shit. Executive. The member of the Special Operations Executive was a source of great controversy within the British military establishment. Most British generals believed war was the first and foremost about chivalry and honor, that it must be fought in adherence to the laws of war. While no single document can be identified as the ancient source from which the laws of war have evolved, modern-day codes of conduct stem from the Liber Code, a set of 157 rules written by lawyer and university professor Francis Liber during the American Civil War, issued on April 24, 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln as General Orders Number 100. As these rules were to serve as uniform code of conduct governing the behavior of the Union Army, the Confederate Army, and the armies of Europe, they were later expanded upon in Hague Convention resolutions of 1899 and 1907. Rule 148 of the Liber Code explicitly prohibited assassination. Civilized nations look with horror upon offers of rewards for the assassination of enemies as relapses into barbarism, Liber wrote. Guerrilla fighters were labeled as insidious enemies and therefore not entitled to the protection of the laws of war. War, like sport, was to be a gentleman's game. Guerrilla warfare was most ungentlemanly, based as it was on treacherous principles like sabotage and subversion. Sabotage during World War II meant blowing up trains, bridges, and production plants behind enemy lines. Situations in which civilians would likely be killed. Subversion, or undermining the authority of an occupying force, required a host of dirty tricks and deceptive acts, including assassination. But Prime Minister Winston Churchill believed that the Special Operations Executive Division D for destruction was necessary, and he personally approved of every mission it undertook, because guerrilla warfare in general, and Special Operations Executives operations in particular, were considered ungentlemanly. The Special Operations Executive became known as Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. The guy wanted to use chemical weapons on people. What the fuck? This is ungentlemanly. Commandos like Hubris and Gabkick were trained to infiltrate enemy-occupied territories, perform hit-and-run operations, and then disappear. The short-term goal of their efforts was to create paranoia among Nazi officials and embolden underground resistance movements. The long-term goal of the Special Operations Executive was to prepare the battlefield for an upcoming Allied invasion. In Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich was in charge. He was also one of the most influential and powerful generals in the vast Nazi war machine. Heydrich reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, the ambitious, sadistic Reichsfuhrer, whose evil knew no bounds. Hydra created a supervised and wait a minute. Hydra created the Einsatzgruppen, extermination squads whose 3,000 members shot and killed more than 1 million men, women, and children during the war. He served as one of the main architects of the final solution and personally initiated the deportation and mass murder of European Jews. Okay, what was that? The final solution. Look into that little tidbit. There are some lies out there. Anyways, he served as one. Okay, you got that one. In 1942, he was at the top of the Special Operations Executive's kill list. At Special Operations Executive, the Heydrich assassination operation was handled jointly by two men, Major General Sir Colin McVean Gubbins, a decorated World War I hero and Special Operations Executive Director of Operations, and František Moravec, the former chief of Czech military intelligence, then living in England in exile. As with most Special Operation Executive Commandos, Jan Kubis and Joseph Gabkek had been handpicked for bravery, cunning, and a willingness to ruthlessly kill. The whole art of guerrilla warfare lies in striking the enemy where he least expects it, and yet where he is most vulnerable. Gubbins instructed his men, inflict the maximum amount of damage in a short amount of time and get away. The Special Operations Executive considered assassination a necessary dark art, a way to weaken the Nazis' impenetrable hold on power. A successful operation required months of planning by Gubbins and Moravec, followed by months of intense training and rehearsing by Kubis and Gabkik. Much of the work took place in a classified Special Operations Executive facility in Scotland, codenamed Training Center STS-25. Here, the assassins trained in guerrilla warfare tactics included hand-to-hand combat, sharpshooting, covert and concealment, and the manufacture of homemade bombs. They learned map reading and code deciphering, how to slit the throat of a sentry or guard without making a sound. Finally given the green light, Kubis and Gabkek were flown in under cover of darkness by a British pilot and crew of 5. They jumped out of the aircraft over a village just east of Prague and parachuted in behind enemy lines. Safely on the ground, the two commandos met up with resistance fighters who hid them from discovery until they were ready to strike. On May 27th, 1942, the moment arrived. There, in Nazi-occupied Holesweiss, Kubis and Gabkik lay camouflaged in the grass. They'd arrived to the targeted area on bicycles, now stashed in a nearby grove of trees. Each man had a pistol in his pocket. Gabkik carried a Sten submachine gun. Kubis held an assassination weapon, an anti-tank grenade that had been specifically modified by British explosives expert Cecil Clarke. The small bomb needed to be powerful enough to shatter the armor plating on Heydrich's Mercedes so as to kill him, but light enough to be accurately thrown by John Cubis. High on the hill above the assassins, a signal mirrored flashed. Heydrich's Mercedes had been spotted by a local Czech accomplice, Joseph Valkic. Soon, the car would round the corner and approach where Cubis and Gabkick were concealed. The planning had been meticulously mapped out. The geography of the land was such that at mid-hill, the road twisted in a hairpin turn, meaning Heydrich's chauffeur would be forced to brake and slow down. Cubis and Gabkick would have a 5-second window to kill Reinhard Heydrich and flee. As the car made its way down the hill, the assassins could see that the top of Heydrich's Mercedes 320 convertible B was open wide. Opportunity at hand. Gabkick stood up, released the catch on his Sten submachine gun, and rushed towards the sharpest point in the road's curve. As at the Mercedes braked and decelerated, Gabkick took aim and fired, bracing himself for a powerful explosion of gunfire. Instead, a catastrophic misfire. Nothing but the impotent click of the weapon as it failed to fire. Gabkick, now standing there in the road, was mortally exposed. Heydrich's drivers screeched to a full stop. SS Obergruppenführer Johannes Klein was an imposing Nazi chauffeur and bodyguard. 6'3", he was trained in the art of tactical military driving. Had he followed Third Reich protocol, Klein would have accelerated and sped away. But Heydrich apparently ordered Klein to stop the car. With Gabkick still standing next to the Mercedes, Heydrich pulled his Luger from its holster, stood up in the convertible, and began shooting at Gabkick. What Reinhard Heydrich failed to realize was that a second Special Operations Executive trained assassin was nearby. John Cubis moved into action. Following protocols learned over months of Special Operation Executive Commando training, he stepped forward and hurled the incendiary device into Heydrich's Mercedes. In the chaos of the moment, he missed. Instead, the bomb exploded against the car's right rear fender, sending glass and metal shards flying through the air. Reinhard Heydrich was hit by debris. Not realizing he'd been wounded, Heydrich got out of the car and continued firing. Ditching his faulty submachine gun, Gabkick returned fire with his pistol. Enraged, Heydrich lumbered toward his assassin as Gabkick sought cover behind a telephone pole. As the smoke from the car bomb cleared, Cubis emerged, bleeding from a head wound. One witness described blood pouring down from his forehead into his eyes. Klein exited the car and began firing at Cubis. Improbably, the bodyguard's gun also jammed, affording Cubis a time to flee. All these shitty guns. Gabkick remained pinned down behind the telephone pole, engaged in a lethal exchange of gunfire with Heydrich. But as Heydrich charged, still firing at Gabkick, he suddenly and dramatically collapsed in the road. The debris from the bomb had penetrated his skin and lodged in his organs. Adolf Hitler's powerful deputy lay stricken on the pavement, unable to move. "Get that bastard," Heinrich shouted at Klein, pointing in the direction of Gabkick as he fled. The chauffeur chased the assassin across the field, leaving Heydrich writhing in pain on the road. Cubis and Gabkick escaped. Heydrich was rushed to a nearby Bulvoka hospital, where 3 of the Nazis' most senior doctors came to his aid. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, Karl Brandt, Nazi health commissioner, and Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the Waffen-SS, concluded that Heydrich's diaphragm was torn and that the grenade fragments were embedded in his spine. Not necessarily life-threatening injuries, but 3 physicians overlooked the fact that tiny bits of horsehair from the upholstered seats of the Mercedes had lodged into Heydrich's spleen. Excuse me. Just a few days later, on June 4th, 1942, the man with the iron heart died from septicemia, or blood poisoning. When Hitler learned of Heydrich's assassination, he became enraged. Privately, he blamed Reinhard Heydrich for his own careless death, since its opportunity, which makes not only the thief, but also the assassin, such heroic gestures as driving in an open, unarmored vehicle or walking about the streets unguarded are just damned stupidity, which serves the fatherland not one whit, Hitler said on the day Heydrich died. That man as irreplaceable as Heydrich should expose himself. Wait a minute. That man as irreplaceable as Heydrich should expose himself to unnecessary danger. I can only condemn him as stupid and idiotic. Publicly, Hitler demanded revenge. That the assassins had been able to escape and go into hiding was an outrageous insult to the Third Reich. At Heinrich's funeral in Berlin, Hitler ordered his ministers in Prague to find the assassinations or else. The reprisals were brutal, indiscriminate, and far-reaching. The barbaric idea was to terrify the Czech people by completely destroying a village at random, said František Moravec, former chief of Czech military intelligence and the man who trained the assassins. Northeast of Prague, the Gestapo cordoned off Lidice, rounded up all 173 male inhabitants, and executed them in the village square. 300 women and children were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp for extermination. The houses in the village were set on fire, then bulldozed over so no trace remained. The operation was executed with such toughness that even the person who happened to be absent from the village on the night of this destruction were gradually located and executed, said Moravec. A reward of 1 million Reichsmarks was offered for information on the assassin's whereabouts. A local Nazi collaborator named Alois Kral revealed that John Skubris and Joseph Gabkek were hiding in the basement of a Russian Orthodox church in Prague. Nazi commandos stormed the church, and when they determined that Kubis and Gabkek were located in the tunnels below, they flooded the basement with water. Kubis tried to fight his way out, but was mortally wounded. Gabkek, knowing he would soon be killed or captured, swallowed a cyanide pill given to him by the Special Operations Executive, Both men's bodies were recovered and buried in a mass grave. The reprisals did not end in Ladies. 5 days later, Nazis razed Lazeke after a shortwave radio transmission was found to have been sent from a village to the British. All 33 residents and their children were killed. The following week, 115 people accused of being members of the Czech resistance were executed. Heydrich's successor, SS General Kurt Dalloge, boasted that in retaliation for killing Reinhard Heydrich, 1,331 Czech citizens were executed and another 3,000 Jews exterminated. Was it worth it? 5,000 Czechs paid with their lives for the death of a single Nazi maniac, Moravec lamented after the war. In 1945, after the Germans surrendered, Moravec returned to Prague to speak with Alois Kral, imprisoned and awaiting trial for Nazi collaboration. "Greetings, Brother Karl," said sarcastically to Moravec when the two men met. "Brother?" asked Moravec, astonished. "I killed 2 Czech citizens. You killed 5,000. Which of us hangs?" Kral asked. It was Kral who was hanged. General Moravec watched the execution. By then, Czechoslovakia had become part of the communist Soviet bloc. After the execution, as Moravec walked away, he stopped to ask a question of a communist functionary. As a Czech national, a man familiar with the Heydrich case, "Will you please tell me where Cubis and Gabkek are buried?" Moravec asked. "Nowhere," came the abrupt answer. "There are no graves. You foot-kissers of the British are not going to have that excuse to build a statue and hang wreaths. Czech heroes are communists now. And so it goes. Wars are fought. One side wins, the other side loses, some go home, others become casualties, freed from Nazi rule. The Czechs lived under a communist-led government that answered to another tyrant, Joseph Stalin. For the second time in a decade, Franz Titek Moravec fled his country, this time for America. There, the former head of Czech military intelligence took a job as an advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense, where he worked until suffering a heart attack in 1966. He died in the parking lot of the Pentagon, seated in the front seat of his car. To the Special Operations executive, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich was necessary and justified. Just like Madeleine Albright, were the millions of Iraqi children's dead good? I think it was good. The spectacle killing of a top Nazi general poked holes in the armor of the Nazi war machine. To the general Czech population, it made the strong appear weak. Inside the Third Reich, the meticulously planned and executed assassination operation gave rise and fear and paranoia among other Nazi officials. When Winston Churchill was briefed on Operation Anthropoid, he expressed approval. When U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt asked whether the British had a hand in Heydrich's assassination, Churchill is said to have winked. In Washington, D.C., a retired World War I general and recipient of the Medal of Honor named William J. Donovan had been trying for years to get President Roosevelt to authorize an unconventional warfare modeled after Special Operations Executive. 2 weeks after Reinhard Heydrich's assassination, Donovan got his wish. As per Executive Order 9182, the Office of Strategic Services was born. A closely held secret at the time, but now famously known as the wartime processor of the CIA. Under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, OSS would work in partnership with SOE. William J. Donovan was made director, and within days of its creation, recruiting for OSS was in full swing. At Fort Polk in Louisiana, U.S. Army officer Aaron Bank, 40, was restless and bored. It had been 17 months since the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor and the same amount of time since Bank had requested troop assignment. He was burning to see combat. But in the eyes of the U.S. Army, Aaron Bank was too old. And so instead he'd been assigned to a railroad battalion, overseeing soldiers lay tracks connecting Fort Polk to Camp Claiborne, 50 miles away. My spirits were low with such unrewarding duties, he told a friend. One day in the spring of 1943, passing the adjunct's tent, Banks spotted and noticed a bulletin board. The Army was looking for volunteers. The notice read, "Likelihood of a dangerous mission guaranteed." Knowing the French or another European language was the only requirement, but volunteers would need to qualify as paratroopers. My pulse quickened, Bank later recalled. A ray of hope appeared. Fluent in French and eager to jump out of airplanes, Banks signed up. A few days later, he received orders. He was to report to the Q building in Washington, D.C., wearing civilian clothes. Aaron Bank did not yet know it, but he'd been assigned to the OSS. So its Special Operations Branch, the American equivalent of the Special Operations Executive Division, Destruction, D. The mandate of the Special Operations Branch was to effect physical subversion of the enemy in 3 distinct phases: infiltrate, perpetrate the battlefield, and conduct sabotage and subversion. Bank was assigned to the French operational group for Operation Jedburgh. Initial training took place at a secret facility in Prince William Fortress Park in Virginia that went by the code name Area B. Volunteers learned right away the kinds of commando operations they were being prepared for. Either you kill or capture, or you will be killed or captured. The Jedburghs were told. The instruction that emphasized by the Fetterbang Sykes OSS stiletto knife issued to members, this double-edged weapon designed exclusively for surprise attacks and killings resembled a dagger. Its foil grip and slender blade made for easy penetration into a man's ribcage. How best to use the now legendary Fairbairn Sykes stiletto in hand-to-hand combat was taught to the Jedburghs by Colonel William E. Fairbairn, one of the knife's designers. In close quarters fighting, there is no more deadly weapon than a knife. An entirely unarmed man has no certain defense against it, Fairbairn explained. Of Fairbairn's training, a young recruit named Reinhard Helms had this to say: "Within 15 seconds, I came to realize that my private parts were in constant jeopardy. Helms would one day serve as the 8th Director of Central Intelligence." In addition to the art of knife making, Jedburgh learned pistol shooting and grenade throwing, how to kill a man with a pencil to the throat, how to garrote the enemy with piano wire. In evade and escape training, they practiced rope climbing and map reading, how to cross raging river and scale a cliff. To master the art of sabotage, the Jedburghs learned to construct bombs powerful enough to blow up bridges, canal locks, and industrial plants. To infiltrate territory laced with landmines, they practiced an obstacle course laced with small explosive charges called demolition trial. Sounds badass. Trainees were told to keep their heads down and stay low. The only injury recorded was sustained by a young officer who broke his jaw and lost several teeth in a small explosion. The injured commando, William J. Casey, would one day serve as the 16th Director of Central Intelligence under President Ronald Reagan. I guess he got paid off, huh? The OSS trained its agents to work from a mindset that was diametrically opposed to U.S. Army doctrine at the time. Conventional warfare was based upon frontal assault against the enemy's main line of resistance. On colossal tank battles combined with air power and Army ground force assault, guerrilla warfare, also called unconventional warfare and irregular warfare, was the opposite. Close quarters combat and throat slitting were par of the course, whereas infantry soldiers followed strict orders within a chain of command. Jedburghs were trained in the art of self-reliance. They were volunteering for mysterious and often solo assignments involving improvisation on the ground. OSS Chief William Donovan believed in the necessity of guerrilla warfare, a sentiment he conveyed to President Roosevelt in a letter housed at the National Archives. "My observation is that the more the battle machines are perfected, the greater the need in modern warfare of men calculating, reckless, with disciplined daring, who are trained for aggressive action." Yikes, Mr. Donovan. Donovan said, "It will mean a return to our old tradition of the Scouts, Raiders, and the Rangers." He insisted in a reference to the unconventional warfare tactics used during the American Revolution. To understand and embrace OSS-style guerrilla warfare was to reject preconceived notions of honor, chivalry, and fair play as the gentleman's way of war. What I want you to know is to get the dirtiest, bloodiest ideas in your head that you can think of for destroying a human being. Think Vietnam. Special Operation Executive Founder General Gubbins educated the Jedburghs. "The fighting I'm going to show you is not a sport. It's every time and always a fight to the death." After 6 weeks, Aaron Bank and 55 American Jedburghs were sent to England for more advanced training, this time with their British, French, and Belgian counterparts on the Scottish shores of Loch Nan-Seal and the Victorian lodge called Arisiag House. The Jedburghs learned how to operate under extreme duress, how to stay awake for days on end, hike 100 miles, raid a building, seize a small town. Finally, in the last phase of training, the multinational Jedburgh teams were sent to a manor in the Cambridgeshire called Milton Hall, one of the largest private homes in England. The manor had been donated to the cause by Lord and Lady Fitzwilliam. Oil portraits of Fitzwilliam family ancestors dating back to 1594 hung on the wall. In the massive sunken gardens, the Jedburghs practiced martial arts. In the converted dairy barns, they learned to decode cipher, feign deafness, and use sign language and transmit Morse code. In the manor's grand library, they watched the Nazi propaganda films, a way to become familiar with how the enemy moved, spoke, and dressed. Milton Hall served as a kind of finishing school for commandos, one of the last stops before embarking on dangerous missions that many would not survive. Jans Hubris and Joseph Gadkek trained at Milton Hall shortly before leaving on their missions to kill Heydrich. The final phase of Jedburgh training involved parachuting infiltration techniques. Taught in Altrichton, Manchester, at a facility codenamed STS-51. This 3-day educational course included 3 live parachute jumps. First in daylight was out of balloon flying 700 feet off the ground. The second was out of an airplane flying at an altitude of roughly 500 feet. The third served as a dry run for insertion behind enemy lines. In the dead of night, commandos jumped out of a plane flying roughly 1,500 feet. Halo jumps. On June 5th, 1944, on the eve of Normandy invasion, the 1st Jedburgh team, codenamed Team Hugh, parachuted into Nazi-occupied France with instruction from Prime Minister Winston Churchill to set Europe ablaze. What an asshole. 92 Jedburgh teams would follow, including one led by Aaron Bank, a now advanced chief of guerrilla warfare operations in France. The mission of these Jedburgh teams was to blow up infrastructure, kill Nazis, and disappear without a trace. In this way, the official motto of the Jedburghs became surprise, kill, vanish. In Texas, Billy Waugh learned about the Normandy invasion from the radio at his grandmother's house. Winnie Waugh lived directly across the street, and whenever Billy had a chance, he listened to programs like GI Live and This Is Our Enemy. On the afternoon of June 6, 1944, NBC Radio announced the D-Day invasion of Nazi-occupied France. Then came the newsreel of the Normandy invasion. The most amazing footage was of 1,500 airplanes dropping thousands of American paratroopers into France, their silk canopies filling the skies like balloons. To Billy, operators were mythic, and when he heard that recruiting stations in Los Angeles, California, allowed boys of 15 to pass for older and join the war, he decided to run away and become a combat soldier. Billy Waugh packed a bag and hit the road, hitchhiking west out of Bastrop. He made it 650 miles to Las Cruces, New Mexico. He failed to produce identification. He was arrested for truancy and put in jail. The police said they'd release him only if he could produce enough money to buy his bus ticket back home. With no choice but to call his mother, Billy Waller picked up the phone. His mother agreed to wire him bus fare if he promised to finish school. Billy kept his word. This war would end without him, but he was now determined to become a U.S. Army paratrooper, first thing after high school. Oh, me neck. In Europe, as part of the plan called Operation Foxley, the British Special Operations Executive continued of ways to assassinate Adolf Hitler. One plot called for a sniper to shoot Hitler during his morning walk around Berghof, his resistance in the Bavarian Alps, his residence inside the Bavarian Alps, using a Mauser Kar 98K with a telescopic sight. Another plan involved sending a single commando into Nazi Germany to poison Hitler's food with an unidentified toxin named I would think that would be shellfish poisoning. A weaponized version. And in the third plot, commandos would attract a suitcase full of explosives under the Führer's train car. But the laws of war forbade assassination, and many British generals worried that such a high-profile assassination could open the doors to a war crimes trial. Not everyone agreed. On the pro-assassin side was Air Vice Marshal A.P. Ritchie, who told colleagues that the German people viewed Hitler as something more than human. To Ritchie, it was this mystical hold which Hitler exercises over the German people that is largely responsible for keeping the country together at the present time. Oh, my neck's on fire. In a bid for assassination, he argued, remove Hitler and there is nothing left. But Vice Marshal Ritchie was a minority voice. Decades earlier, in 1907, 44 nations had met at The Hague to formalize the laws of war as had been originally written in the Lieber Code. The laws and customs of war on land, Hague, the fourth assassination, was further defined to include any form of treacherous killing. Wartime killing had a sharp distinction. The authors wrote, citing by example two contradictory ways to kill a general or a king. One considered a treacherous war crime, the other a lawful killing. The soldier is forbidden to sneak into the tent of a general or a king disguised and say a peddler. But if that soldier is in uniform and is part of a small attacking force, then he is allowed and encouraged to kill the general or the king. Or soldier is a vile assassin, the other a brave and devoted soldier. According to the Hague Convention, the reason for distinction, the authors wrote, was to diminish the evils of war. Also, and so, despite how arbitrary this and other prohibitions seemed to some, the British Special Operations Executive's plan was to assassinate Hitler were scrapped. There was no way the SOE commando could operate inside Nazi Germany wearing a uniform of the British Army, it was argued. But over the Office of Strategic Services, the Boldness Operation, Damn. I really just lost my place. Okay. There was no way an Special Operations Executive Commando could operate inside Nazi Germany wearing a uniform of the British Army, it was argued. But over at the Office of Strategic Services, the boldness of Operation Foxley inspired the OSS Chief of Secret Intelligence for Operations in Europe to devise a Hitler assassination plot of his own. The chief was a young American lawyer turned commando named William J. Casey, the same young man who'd broke his jaw and lost several teeth on the demolition trail while training for OSS Special Operations at Area B. To Casey's eye, if the OSS was going to defy the laws and customs of war on land in order to assassinate Hitler, why stumble over a rule regarding uniforms? His audaciously deceptive plan, called Operation Iron Cross, was to insert an OSS commando team disguised as enemy soldiers wearing Nazi uniforms to lead this 5-man OSS team, which would be populated by a battalion turncoat Nazi Bill Casey, chose Aaron Paul. The two men had trained together back at Prince William Park in Virginia at Area B. After the war, Aaron Bank recalled Bill Casey describing Operation Iron Cross to him as the most important assassination operation of the war. The OSS had recently captured, turned, and trained 175 German prisoners of war. These men, formerly avowed Nazis, were now willing to work for the OSS. In the winter of 1945, the plan was to have Aaron Bank, a 4-man OSS team, and the captured Nazi parachute and behind enemy lines posing as the Wehrmacht soldiers team called the OSS Iron Cross because mountain infantry would hike through the mountain terrain, locate Hitler's eagle nest hiding away, ambush the Nazi leader, and kill him. But to command such a unit deep in enemy territory involved extreme risk. The drop zone chosen would be deep within the Inn Valley in Austria. There would be no backup air support, no infantry army to call. All it would take was one double-sider, one Nazi POW, still secretly loyal to Hitler, and the mission would unravel. In all likelihood, the OSS team, led by Aaron Bank, would be executed on the spot. Setting aside worry over the Hague resolution against treacherous killing, Bill Casey was concerned about the certain rule of engagement, ROE, rule of engagement, issued by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, to whom he was fiercely loved. General Eisenhower had forbidden the U.S. Army and the OSS from recruiting and hiring Nazi POWs for any kind of mission. Casey, skilled lawyer that he was, appreciated loopholes by encouraging the Nazis to volunteer for the Iron Cross Mountain Infantry mission. He created a legal go-around that allowed him to proceed. Tricky little bastard. A chief OSS Special Operations in Europe, Bill Casey had authorized dozens of teams airdropped into the area, but he remained curious about inserting the Iron Cross Mountain Infantry because he knew that the area around the Eagle's Nest was to be heavily guarded by the elite Nazi commandos. Still, Casey authorized Bank. Wait. Still, Casey authorized Bank to begin preparing the all and awaited instruction. Holy neck. At an undisclosed European location, Bank led commando training teaching Nazi turncoats new infiltration techniques, including how to extract individuals from armored cars and how to storm a mock-up of Target. The plot advanced to the point where Bank was given a large sum of cash with no money payback bribes and a gold ring to barter for his freedom. In that event, he was separated and captured. Each OSS operator was given 4 cyanide capsules, as Jan Kubrus and Joseph Gapkick had been. The prospect of killing Adolf Hitler caused Aaron Bank to lie awake at night thinking wild thoughts, working world-shattering in scope. He later wrote, if Bank's OSS team succeeded in killing Adolf Hitler, it would be the end of the war, because the German general staff would surely surrender with no one left to command the army, wrote Bank. This would be the only time in history that 5 guys would be responsible for ending a major war. Bank continued to train the Iron Cross Mountain Infantry. He and his men conducted a dangerous dry run over the top zone, practicing reconnaissance and exfiltration techniques. Then he waited and waited. The anticipation was excruciating. Forums hung the Alps first 4 days. Where am I? I'm sorry, guys. Then he waited and waited. The anticipation was excruciating. Storms hung over the Alps for the first days, then weeks. In April 1945, finally Aaron Bank was flown to Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Paris, for a classified briefing with General Eisenhower. The U.S. Army had moved infantry soldiers into the Inn Valley. There were boots on the ground now, closing in around the Eagle's Nest. Operation Iron Cross was canceled. The Bank was devastated to kill or capture Hitler. It was the community of a lifetime. In a flash, it was gone. On May 7, 1945, the Nazis surrendered at a brief ceremony inside schoolhouse in Reims. In France, General Walter Bedell Smith Eisenhower, Chief of Staff, officiated the historic end of the Third Reich. 3 months later, after the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Imperial Japan surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, ending World War II. 6 weeks later, on October 1st, 1945, an order abolishing the OSS. Truman disliked William Donovan and his band of ungentlemanly warriors. In a curt memorandum, the president thanked Donovan for his service and wished him well. To President Truman's eyes, America was the new standard bearer of democratic ideals. The U.S. military was the mightiest in the world. Soldiers of a democracy do not fight guerrilla wars. Gentlemen do not slit throats. In Bastrop, Texas, Billy Waugh took part in every victorious parade. victory parade. He'd stand on the corner when the parade began, waving his flag at the war heroes. Then he'd duck away from the crowds, race through an alleyway, and get back to the streets. In advance of the marching men, he repeated this action all morning or afternoon until the parade ended. 2 local Marines, wounded in the war, were especially interesting to him. One had wounded the head, and the other wore a cast on his leg. Whenever I was near him, remembers Waugh, in a street or store, I felt awed in their presence. I admired their strength and nobility. 1 month after graduating from high school, Billy Waugh joined the U.S. Army as a paratrooper. He was off to Fort Benning in Georgia to learn how to jump out of airplanes. His whole life was in front of him, and it felt great. And that's it for Chapter 1.